The dust never settled in Tombstone Ridge. It swirled around Jake Morrison's worn boots as he shuffled down the main street, keeping his head low to avoid the mocking stares that had become as familiar as his own shadow. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on his thin frame, and sweat stained his threadbare shirt, the only one he owned that wasn't torn beyond repair. At 25, Jake had the hollow look of a man who'd been beaten down by life one too many times. His shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make himself smaller, invisible. The other cowboys called him Spineless Jake when they bothered to acknowledge him at all. Most of the time, they just laughed. "Hey, Morrison!" called out Buck Hendricks from across the street. The burly ranch foreman leaned against the hitching post outside Miller's General Store, surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers. "Still looking for work, or did you finally accept that you ain't cut out for cowboy life?" The group erupted in laughter. Jake's cheeks burned, but he kept walking. He'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. "Maybe he could get a job as a scarecrow," suggested Tommy Rodriguez, Buck's right-hand man. "Lord knows he's got the build for it, and he's already good at standing around doing nothing." More laughter followed Jake down the dusty street. His stomach growled, a constant companion these days. He'd been living on scraps for weeks ever since Old Man Patterson fired him for spooking the cattle during a routine roundup. The truth was, Jake had been thrown from his horse when it reared at a rattlesnake. The other cowboys had scattered the herd, laughing at his misfortune, instead of helping. As he approached the Silver Dollar Saloon, Jake noticed an unusual crowd gathered around a colorful wagon parked near the entrance. A man in a fancy purple vest and a top hat stood on a makeshift platform, addressing the growing audience with theatrical gestures. "Ladies and gentlemen of this fine establishment," the stranger called out in a booming voice that carried clear across the street, "I come to you today with a miracle beyond your wildest dreams." Jake found himself drawn closer, curiosity overcoming his usual desire to avoid crowds. The man on the platform was unlike anyone he'd ever seen in Tombstone Ridge, clean-shaven, with slicked-back hair and a gold tooth that glinted in the afternoon sun. "My name is Professor Cornelius Blackwood," the man continued, producing a small brown bottle from his vest pocket. "And this, my friends, is genuine wizard oil, a mystical elixir discovered in the ancient caves of the Apache, blessed by medicine men whose secrets have been lost to time." Several cowboys had gathered around, including Buck and his crew. Jake hung back, staying in the shadows near the saloon's wall. "This remarkable potion," Professor Blackwood continued, holding the bottle high, "grants the user extraordinary courage, lightning-fast reflexes, and most remarkably of all, protection from harm that borders on the supernatural." "That's horseshit," called out Buck Hendricks. "Ain't no oil gonna make a man bulletproof." Professor Blackwood smiled mysteriously. "Ah, a skeptic. I respect that, sir. But I've seen this elixir turn cowards into heroes, weaklings into legends. Why, just last month in Dodge City, a timid shopkeeper took one swig and faced down 3 armed bandits with nothing but his bare hands." Jake felt his heart racing. He'd heard stories like this before, traveling salesmen with miracle cures and impossible promises. But something about Professor Blackwood's confidence, his absolute certainty, made Jake want to believe. "How much?" called out a voice from the crowd. "For such a precious commodity, one might expect to pay $20, $30, even $50, the professor replied. "But I am a man of the people. Today only I offer genuine wizard oil for the remarkably low price of $1 per bottle." $1. Jake's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where his last silver coin lay, his final possession of any value. It was supposed to buy him food, maybe enough beans and hardtack to last a few days while he searched for work. But as he watched the other cowboys laughing and dismissing the professor's claims, something desperate stirred inside Jake's chest. What did he have to lose? He was already at rock bottom, already the laughingstock of the entire territory. If there was even the slimmest chance that this oil could change his life, before he could talk himself out of it, Jake stepped forward from the shadows. "I'll take one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd turned to look at him, and Jake felt his face flush red. Buck Hendricks let out a loud guffaw. "Well, I'll be damned," Buck shouted. "Spineless Jake's gonna buy some snake oil. This ought to be rich." Jake's hands trembled as he pulled out his silver dollar, but Professor Blackwood's eyes lit up with genuine delight. "Ah, a true believer," the professor exclaimed, stepping down from his platform. "Young man, you have made a wise investment indeed. This bottle contains enough wizard oil for 3 applications. Use it wisely and your life will never be the same." Jake handed over his last dollar and received the small brown bottle in return. It was warm to the touch and smelled faintly of herbs and alcohol when he uncorked it. "Now remember," Professor Blackwood said in a lower voice, meant just for Jake, "the oil works best when you truly believe in its power. Doubt is the enemy of magic, my boy." As Jake walked away, clutching the bottle like a lifeline, the laughter of the other cowboys followed him down the street. But for the first time in months, he didn't care. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, Jake Morrison would be a new man. Jake sat alone in his ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of town, staring at the brown bottle by the flickering light of a single candle. The walls around him told the story of his failures. Cracked boards he couldn't afford to replace, a leaky roof patched with whatever scraps he could find, and furniture that consisted of little more than an old crate and a straw mattress. The bottle seemed to glow in the candlelight, though Jake knew that was just his imagination. He'd been holding it for 3 hours now, ever since returning from town, turning it over in his hands and reading the ornate label, Professor Blackwood's genuine wizard oil for courage, strength, and protection. His stomach cramped with hunger. That dollar could have bought him a week's worth of beans and hardtack. Instead, he'd traded his last meal for what was probably nothing more than colored water and false hope. But Professor Blackwood's words echoed in his mind. Doubt is the enemy of magic. Jake uncorked the bottle and took a small sip. The liquid burned, going down. It tasted like whiskey mixed with bitter herbs and something he couldn't identify. Almost immediately, warmth spread through his chest, and he felt a tingling sensation in his fingertips. "Just the alcohol," he muttered to himself, but took another sip anyway. Within minutes, something extraordinary happened. The familiar weight of fear and self-doubt that had pressed down on Jake's shoulders for years began to lift. His breathing deepened, his spine straightened, and for the first time in memory, he looked directly at his reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. The man staring back at him didn't look weak. Sure, he was still thin, still wore patched clothes, but there was something different in his eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. Jake corked the bottle carefully, saving the rest for when he really needed it, and settled down to sleep. For once, he didn't toss and turn with worries about tomorrow. Instead, he slept deeply, dreamlessly, and when he woke at dawn, the confidence was still there. The morning sun painted Tombstone Ridge in golden hues as Jake walked down Main Street. But this time, he didn't keep his head down. This time, he walked tall, his shoulders square, meeting the eyes of everyone he passed. Mary Catherine O'Brien was sweeping the front steps of her family's boarding house when she saw him coming. She'd always felt sorry for Jake Morrison. He seemed like a decent man who'd just had all the fight beaten out of him. But today, something was different. "Morning, Miss O'Brien," Jake said, tipping his hat with a confidence she'd never seen before. "Good morning, Jake," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "You're looking well today." "Feeling well too, ma'am." "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Before she could respond, Jake continued down the street with a stride that commanded attention. Mary Catherine found herself watching him go, a small smile playing at her lips. Jake's first stop was Murphy's ranch, where he'd been trying to get work for months. Ranch owner Sean Murphy was known throughout the territory as a fair but demanding boss who had no patience for weakness. "Morrison," Murphy called out as Jake approached the main house. What brings you out here? I told you last week I got no work for—" He stopped mid-sentence, studying Jake's face. "You look different. Stand up straighter." "I feel different, Mr. Murphy," Jake replied, his voice steady and clear. "I'm here to ask for another chance. I know I've disappointed you before, but I'm not the same man I was yesterday." Murphy scratched his grizzled chin, intrigued despite himself. "What happened to you, boy? Yesterday you couldn't look me in the eye, and now you're standing here like you own the place." Jake's hand unconsciously moved to his shirt pocket, where the bottle of wizard oil rested safely. "Let's just say I found something that reminds me who I really am underneath all the fear." "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy muttered. "Tell you what, Morrison, I got a problem that needs solving, and if you can handle it, I'll give you steady work. But it ain't gonna be easy." "I'm listening, sir." Murphy pointed toward the eastern pasture. "Got a bull out there, big black Angus named Satan. He's been terrorizing my men for weeks, won't let anyone near the herd. Lost 2 good cowboys already, and they ain't coming back till that bull is dealt with. You think you can handle that?" The old Jake would have made excuses and backed down. But the Jake standing here now, with wizard oil coursing through his veins and confidence flooding his mind, simply nodded. "Where do you keep your ropes, Mr. Murphy?" 20 minutes later, Jake stood at the fence line of the eastern pasture, studying the massive bull that had earned its hellish name. Satan was indeed a monster, easily twice the size of most cattle, with horns that could gore a man in half and eyes that burned with pure aggression. Several ranch hands had gathered to watch, drawn by word that spineless Jake was about to face down the devil himself. Among them was Tommy Rodriguez, Buck Hendrick's right-hand man. "This is gonna be good," Tommy called out. "Hope you said your prayers, Morrison." But Jake wasn't listening to the taunts. His entire focus was on the bull, and for the first time in his life he felt no fear. The wizard oil had awakened something inside him, not magical powers, but something far more valuable, absolute belief in himself. He climbed over the fence and walked calmly toward the center of the pasture. Satan immediately noticed the intrusion, pawing the ground and snorting with rage. The massive beast lowered its head and charged. Jake stood perfectly still until the last possible second, then stepped aside with fluid grace, letting the bull thunder past. The crowd gasped in amazement. "Holy hell," whispered one of Murphy's men. "Did you see how calm he was?" Satan wheeled around for another charge, even more enraged than before. Again, Jake waited. Again, he stepped aside at precisely the right moment, this time slipping the rope around the bull's neck as it passed. Within 10 minutes, Jake had the beast completely under control, leading it docilely back toward the barn like an oversized puppy. Sean Murphy shook his head in disbelief. "Morrison, I don't know what's gotten into you, but you got yourself a job. $20 a week plus room and board." As Jake shook Murphy's hand, he could hear the amazed whispers of the watching cowboys. Word would spread quickly through Tombstone Ridge. Spineless Jake Morrison had faced down Satan himself and lived to tell about it. But this was only the beginning. By sunset, the story had already begun to change. Tommy Rodriguez burst through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon like a man possessed, his face flushed with excitement and whiskey. The usual crowd of cowboys, drifters, and locals looked up from their cards and drinks as he stumbled to the bar. "You ain't gonna believe what I saw today," Tommy announced, slamming his fist on the scarred wooden surface. "Jake Morrison, spineless Jake, just took down Satan like the bull was a newborn calf." Buck Hendrick snorted from his corner table. "Tommy, you been drinking since noon. Ain't no way Jake Morrison could handle a angry chicken, let alone Murphy's bull." "I'm telling you, Buck, I saw it with my own eyes," Tommy insisted, his voice rising. "That bull charged him full speed and Jake just stood there, didn't even flinch. Then he danced around that beast like he was waltzing at a church social." Bartender Sam Kowalski polished a glass skeptically. "Tommy, we all know Jake Morrison. That boy couldn't intimidate his own shadow." "That's what I thought too," Tommy exclaimed. "But something's different about him, real different. He was walking around town this morning like he owned the place, talking to folks, looking them in the eye. And when that bull came at him," Tommy shook his head in amazement. "I swear on my mother's grave it was like watching a completely different person." From a table near the back, an old-timer named Ezra Hawkins leaned forward. "You said he was different this morning?" "Different how?" "Well, you know how Jake usually skulks around, keeping his head down. Today he was walking tall, confident-like, even tipped his hat to Mary Catherine O'Brien and had a whole conversation with her." "Mary Catherine don't talk to nobody except her family," observed another cowboy. "Girl's been turning down suitors from here to El Paso." Buck Hendricks drained his whiskey and stood up. "This is all horse shit. Tommy's been out in the sun too long. Jake Morrison ain't changed, and he sure as hell didn't face down no bull." But as Buck pushed through the saloon doors to investigate for himself, the seed of the story had already been planted. And like all good stories in a small town, it began to grow. 2 hours later, at Murphy's ranch, the bunkhouse was buzzing with excitement. Jake sat quietly on his new cot, polishing his boots and listening to the other hands rehash the day's events. "I'm telling you, boys, I never seen anything like it," said Pete Williams, a veteran cowboy who'd worked for Murphy for 15 years. "That bull came at Jake like a freight train, and he just moved. Like he knew exactly what Satan was going to do before Satan knew it himself." "How'd he move so fast?" asked Johnny Martinez, the youngest hand on the ranch. "Jake ain't exactly built for speed." "That's just it," Pete replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He wasn't fast, he was something else. Smooth, like he could see the future or something." Jake's hand unconsciously moved to his shirt pocket, where the wizard oil bottle rested. He could feel the other cowboys looking at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity they'd never shown before. "Jake," called out Slim Patterson, the ranch foreman, "how'd you know that bull wouldn't get you? Most men would have been running for the fence." Jake looked up from his boots, meeting Slim's eyes directly. "I just knew he wouldn't. Can't really explain it better than that." It wasn't entirely a lie. The confidence the oil had given him had made everything crystal clear. He'd seen the bull's movements, anticipated its charges, and responded with a certainty he'd never possessed before. "Well, whatever it was, Mr. Murphy's mighty impressed," Slim said. "Says he ain't seen nobody handle livestock like that since his daddy was running cattle in Texas." Meanwhile, back in town, the story continued to evolve. At the boarding house, Mary Catherine O'Brien was having tea with her friend Sarah Mitchell when the conversation turned to the day's excitement. "I heard Jake Morrison tamed that killer bull of Murphy's," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "Tommy Rodriguez was telling everyone at the general store." "Jake did seem different this morning," Mary Catherine admitted. "More substantial somehow, like he'd found his backbone overnight." "Maybe he finally got tired of being pushed around," Sarah suggested. "Sometimes a man just reaches his breaking point and decides to fight back." But in the back of Mary Catherine's mind, she remembered something else about that morning encounter. The way Jake had carried himself, the absolute certainty in his voice. It reminded her of the confidence her father had possessed, the kind of quiet strength that came from deep within. As the evening wore on and the saloons filled up, the story spread from table to table, mouth to mouth. Each telling added new details, new embellishments. "I heard he stared that bull down for a full minute before it charged," claimed one drifter. "My cousin works at Murphy's place," added another. "Says Jake moved like smoke, like the bull couldn't even touch him." "Somebody told me he's been practicing some kind of Apache fighting technique," whispered a third. By the time Buck Hendricks returned from Murphy's ranch, where he'd confirmed that yes, Jake Morrison had indeed subdued the notorious bull, the story had taken on a life of its own. Buck found Tommy Rodriguez holding court at the Silver Dollar, entertaining a growing crowd with increasingly dramatic retellings of the day's events. So there Jake was, standing in the middle of that pasture like a gunfighter at high noon, Tommy was saying, his arms gesturing wildly. And when Satan charged, Jake didn't just step aside. He practically disappeared and reappeared behind the bull like some kind of ghost. "That ain't what happened," Buck interrupted, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Then what did happen, Buck?" Tommy challenged. "You said I was lying, but you went and saw for yourself. What did you find?" Buck hesitated. What he'd found was Jake Morrison sitting calmly in the bunkhouse, polishing his boots like taming killer bulls, was just another day's work. What he'd found was Sean Murphy singing Jake's praises to anyone who'd listen. What he'd found was a dozen witnesses who all agreed that something extraordinary had happened in that pasture. "Jake handled the bull," Buck admitted grudgingly, "but it ain't like Tommy's making it sound." "Then how was it?" pressed another cowboy. Buck struggled for words. The truth was, he hadn't seen the actual confrontation. By the time he'd arrived at the ranch, it was over. All he had were the same second-hand accounts everyone else was hearing, and those accounts all agreed on one thing. Jake Morrison had done the impossible. As the night wore on and the whiskey flowed, the story continued to grow. Jake Morrison, the weakest man in Tombstone Ridge, had somehow become Jake Morrison, the bull tamer. And in a territory where reputation was everything, that was a transformation that nobody could ignore. Back at the ranch, Jake lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, listening to the other hands finally drift off to sleep. The bottle of wizard oil seemed to pulse in his pocket, a warm reminder of the power he'd discovered within himself. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd take another dose. Not because he needed it, the confidence from this morning was still flowing strong, but because he wanted to see just how far this transformation could take him. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Jake Morrison smiled in the darkness. 3 days had passed since Jake's encounter with Satan, and the story had spread beyond Tombstone Ridge, like wildfire across dry grass. Cowboys from neighboring ranches rode into town specifically to get a look at the man who'd tamed Murphy's killer bull, and each visitor left with their own version of the tale to spread further across the territory. Jake had taken small sips from his wizard oil bottle each morning, just enough to maintain the confidence that had transformed his life. The bottle was now half empty, but the effects seemed to be lasting longer each day. He no longer felt like the same broken man who'd been the laughingstock of the territory just a week ago. On Thursday morning, Jake was helping repair fence line on the eastern boundary of Murphy's property when dust clouds appeared on the horizon. 4 riders approached at full gallop, and even from a distance, Jake could see they weren't friendly visitors. "Riders coming in fast, mister." "Murphy," called out Slim Patterson from the main house. Sean Murphy emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the morning sun. "Don't recognize them. Jake, Pete, you boys get ready for trouble. Could be rustlers scouting the herd. But as the riders drew closer, it became clear they weren't rustlers. They were something far worse. The Cassidy brothers, wanted for bank robbery, cattle theft, and murder across 3 territories. The leader, Frank Cassidy, was a mountain of a man with a black beard and cruel eyes. His brothers Charlie and Tom flanked him, while their cousin Eddie brought up the rear. The 4 outlaws reined in their horses 20 yards from the main house, dust swirling around them like smoke from hell itself. "Murphy!" Frank Cassidy called out, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "We heard you got some fine cattle here. We'll be taking a dozen head off your hands." "Like hell you will," Murphy replied, stepping forward with his rifle in hand. "This is private property and you boys ain't welcome here." Frank Cassidy laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Oh man, we ain't asking. We're taking. Question is whether you're gonna make this easy or hard." Jake felt his pulse quicken, but not with fear, with anticipation. The wizard oil seemed to warm in his pocket, and that familiar surge of confidence flooded through his veins. Without thinking, he stepped out from behind the fence post where he'd been working. "I think you boys better ride on," Jake said in a clear, steady voice that carried across the yard. The Cassidy brothers turned to look at him, and Frank's eyes narrowed with amusement. Well, looks like we got ourselves a hero." Frank nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Boy, you got any idea who you're talking to?" "I know exactly who you are," Jake replied, walking slowly toward the center of the yard. "Frank Cassidy, wanted for murder in Colorado, robbery in New Mexico, and cattle theft right here in Arizona. You and your brothers been terrorizing honest folks for too long." Slim Patterson and Pete Williams had taken cover behind the water trough, their rifles trained on the outlaws. But Sean Murphy found himself staring at Jake in amazement. Where had this backbone come from? Charlie Cassidy spat into the dirt. "Frank, let's just shoot him and get on with business." But Frank held up a hand, clearly enjoying himself. "Nah, Charlie. I want to see what this skinny cowboy thinks he can do." He dismounted, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the ground. "Tell you what, boy. You beat me in a fair fight. No guns, just fists, and we'll ride on. But when I beat you, we take 20 head instead of 12. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, feeling the warm glass of the wizard oil bottle. The liquid inside seemed to pulse with power, filling him with absolute certainty. "Fair enough," Jake said, beginning to roll up his sleeves. Frank Cassidy was 6 inches taller and at least 70 pounds heavier than Jake, with arms like tree trunks and hands that had strangled more than one man. As he advanced, cracking his knuckles, several of Murphy's hands began to drift closer, to watch what they were certain would be a slaughter. "Jake," Murphy called out desperately, "you don't have to do this." But Jake wasn't listening. His entire world had narrowed to the giant advancing toward him, and the warm confidence flowing through his body like liquid fire. As Frank threw his first punch, a haymaker that should have taken Jake's head off, something extraordinary happened. Jake moved. Not quickly, not desperately, but with perfect timing and absolute precision. He slipped under Frank's massive fist and drove his own into the outlaw's solar plexus with surgical accuracy. Frank doubled over, gasping for air he couldn't find. What the hell? Charlie Cassidy started to reach for his gun, but Slim Patterson's rifle swung toward him. "You said a fair fight," Slim called out. "Let them finish it." Frank straightened up, his face red with rage and embarrassment. He charged again, this time trying to grapple Jake to the ground where his size advantage would be decisive, but Jake seemed to anticipate every move, flowing around Frank's attacks like water around stone. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, Frank Cassidy lay unconscious in the dirt, and Jake Morrison stood over him without a scratch on his body. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Cassidy brothers sat frozen in their saddles, staring in disbelief at their fallen leader. "Impossible," Tom Cassidy whispered. Jake looked up at the 3 remaining outlaws with eyes that held no fear, no doubt, only quiet certainty. "Your brother gave his word," Jake said calmly. "Time to ride on." For a moment it seemed like the brothers might draw their guns anyway, but something in Jake's demeanor, the absolute confidence, the way he stood perfectly balanced and ready for whatever came next, made them hesitate. "This ain't over," Charlie Cassidy snarled, but he was already spurring his horse toward his unconscious brother. They loaded Frank across his saddle and rode away without taking a single head of cattle, leaving behind a yard full of stunned cowboys and one very bewildered ranch owner. "Jake," Sean Murphy said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "how in the Sam Hill did you do that?" Jake touched the bottle in his pocket one more time, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. "Sometimes a man just finds what he's been looking for his whole life, Mr. Murphy. And once he finds it, there ain't nothing can stop him. As word of Jake's victory spread that evening, the story grew even larger than before. Jake Morrison hadn't just tamed a bull, he'd single-handedly faced down the most feared outlaws in the territory. By midnight, cowboys in 3 different towns were swearing they'd heard Jake Morrison was bulletproof, and in his bunk at Murphy's ranch, Jake Morrison smiled in the darkness, one hand resting on the bottle that had changed his life forever. By dawn on Friday, Jake Morrison's name was being whispered in saloons from Tucson to Santa Fe. The story had taken on mythical proportions, a scrawny cowboy who'd transformed overnight into an unstoppable force, taming killer bulls and defeating notorious outlaws with supernatural ease. Jake stood on the porch of Murphy's ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. The wizard oil bottle in his pocket was nearly empty now, just one small dose remained, but he no longer felt dependent on it. The confidence it had awakened seemed to have taken permanent root in his soul. "Jake," Murphy called from inside the house, "you got visitors coming." A dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon, but this time it wasn't outlaws. A dozen riders approached at an easy pace, cowboys from ranches throughout the territory, all coming to see the legend for themselves. Leading the group was Big Jim Thornton, owner of the largest spread in Arizona, and a man whose word carried weight from the Colorado River to the Rio Grande. Behind him rode representatives from every major ranch within 100 miles. "Morrison!" Big Jim called out as the group reined in their horses. "We need to talk." Jake stepped down from the porch, his movements calm and deliberate. A year ago, he would have been terrified to face such an assembly of powerful men. Now he felt only curiosity. "Gentlemen," Jake said with a slight nod, "what brings you to Murphy's place?" Big Jim dismounted, studying Jake with calculating eyes. "Word is, you handled the Cassidy brothers single-handed. That true?" "Frank Cassidy and I had a disagreement," Jake replied evenly. "We settled it." A murmur ran through the assembled cowboys. Big Jim spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Son, them boys been terrorizing this territory for 3 years. Cost us thousands of head of cattle and killed good men. If you really sent them packing, every rancher from here to Texas owes you a debt." "I was just protecting Mr. Murphy's property," Jake said. "Maybe so, but word's spreading that you got some kind of special protection. They're saying bullets can't touch you, that you move like smoke and fight like the devil himself." Big Jim's eyes narrowed. "They're saying Jake Morrison is bulletproof." Jake felt the weight of their stares, the mixture of respect, fear, and desperate hope in their faces. These were hard men who'd carved ranches out of hostile wilderness, but even they needed heroes to believe in. "I reckon bullets hurt me same as any man," Jake said carefully. "Then prove it," called out a voice from the back of the group. The speaker was Buck Hendricks, sitting his horse with his usual arrogance intact, despite everything that had happened. But there was something different in his eyes now, not mockery, but challenge. "Buck," Big Jim warned, "this ain't the time." "No, I want to see," Buck interrupted, dismounting. "All this talk about Jake Morrison being some kind of miracle man. I want to know if it's real or just lucky breaks and tall tales." The tension in the air was electric. Jake could feel everyone waiting, watching, weighing his response. This was the moment that would define everything, not just his own future, but the legend that had grown around him. Jake's hand moved to his pocket, feeling the nearly empty bottle one last time. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled it out for all to see. "You want to know the truth about Jake Morrison?" he said, holding up the small brown bottle. "This here's Professor Blackwood's wizard oil. Cost me my last dollar 6 days ago." A collective intake of breath ran through the group. Several men leaned forward in their saddles. "This oil didn't give me any magic powers," Jake continued, uncorking the bottle. "Didn't make me bulletproof or faster than lightning. All it did was remind me of something I'd forgotten." He tilted the bottle and poured the remaining contents onto the dusty ground. The liquid soaked into the earth and disappeared, leaving only a small, dark stain. "It reminded me that courage ain't something you're born with," Jake said, tossing the empty bottle aside. "It's something you choose. Every morning, every moment, every time you got to decide between running away or standing your ground." Buck Hendricks stared at the empty bottle, then back at Jake. "You mean you ain't really bulletproof?" "Hell no." Jake's voice carried clearly across the yard. "But I ain't the same man I was a week ago either. That man spent so many years believing he was worthless that he forgot he had any worth. The oil didn't change who I was. It just helped me remember." Big Jim Thornton studied Jake for a long moment, then slowly began to smile. "You know what, Morrison? That makes the whole thing even more impressive. How you figure? asked one of the other ranchers. Because any fool can be brave if he thinks he's got magic protection, Big Jim replied. Takes a real man to face down killers knowing he can die just like anybody else. Buck Hendricks kicked at the dirt where the oil had soaked in. So all this time it was just you? Just me, Jake confirmed. Same as it's always been. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, Buck began to laugh. Not the cruel mockery Jake had endured for years, but genuine, appreciative laughter. Well, I'll be damned, Buck said, extending his hand. Morrison, I owe you an apology. Hell, I owe you about 1,000 apologies. Jake shook Buck's hand, feeling no anger, no resentment, only the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. No need, Buck. We all got our own mountains to climb. Big Jim remounted his horse, but his expression remained thoughtful. Morrison, I got a proposition for you. Territory needs men like you, men who can stand up to the kind of trouble that's been plaguing us. You interested in wearing a badge? Jake looked around at the assembled faces. Men who'd ridden half the morning just to see if the legend was real. What they'd found instead was something better, proof that legends could be made by ordinary people who refused to stay ordinary. Appreciate the offer, Mr. Thornton, Jake said, but I think I'm right where I belong. As the group prepared to ride out, carrying the real story back to their respective ranches, Mary Catherine O'Brien's buggy appeared on the road from town. She pulled up near the assembled riders, her green eyes finding Jake immediately. Good morning, gentlemen, she said with a smile that seemed meant specifically for Jake. I was wondering if I might have a word with Mr. Morrison. Big Jim tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Ma'am, I believe Jake's got all the time in the world for you. As the riders departed, Jake walked over to Mary Catherine's buggy, his heart lighter than it had been in years. I heard what happened with the Cassidy brothers, she said softly. The whole town's talking about it, probably making it sound a lot more exciting than it was, Jake replied. Mary Catherine studied his face, taking in the confidence that had replaced the defeated look she'd known for so long. Jake Morrison, she said finally, would you like to come to dinner Sunday? My family would like to meet the man who's got everyone talking. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with wizard oil and everything to do with the simple joy of being seen, really seen, for who he truly was. Miss O'Brien, he said, I'd be honored. As her buggy disappeared down the road toward town, Jake stood in the morning sun, watching the dust settle around Murphy's ranch. The empty bottle lay where he'd dropped it, already being covered by the shifting Arizona dirt. By sunset, cowboys in 200 saloons across the territory would be telling the story of Jake Morrison, the man who'd found courage in a bottle and strength in himself. Some would say he was bulletproof, others that he moved like a ghost, and still others that he'd made a deal with Apache spirits. But Jake Morrison knew the truth. Sometimes the most powerful magic in the world was simply believing in yourself, and sometimes all it took was $1 worth of colored water and alcohol to help a man remember that the strength he needed had been inside him all along. The legend of the Bulletproof Cowboy had been born not from any supernatural power, but from the most human truth of all, that courage was a choice, and every man had the power to choose who he wanted to be. And Jake Morrison had finally chosen to be himself.